Hello, my name's Eric, and I'm going to be discussing two TPEs, TPE 2 and TPE 4. And I'm going to be discussing for each of those TPEs levels 1 through 5 and comparing and contrasting each level. TPE 2 has to do with creating and maintaining effective environments for student learning, while as for TPE 4, that has to do, I believe, with planning instruction and designing learning experiences for all students. For TPE 2, this one in particular has to do with what I think social emotional learning. And so for TPE, or 2.1, I should say, this one talks about promoting students' social emotional growth, development, and individual responsibility using positive interventions and supports, so restorative justice and conflict resolution practices to foster a nurturing community where each student is treated fairly and respectfully by adults and peers. TPE 2.2 talks about creating an actual learning environment, or the style, I should say, that promotes productive student learning, encourage positive interactions among students, reflect diversity and multiple perspectives, and are culturally responsive. Are we culturally responsive? That's the main gist of TPE 2.2. TPE 2.3 talks about establishing, maintaining, and monitoring inclusive learning environments that are physically, mentally, intellectually, and emotionally healthy and safe to enable all students to learn and recognize and appropriately address instances of intolerance and harassment among students, such as bullying, racism, sexism, just to name a few. TPE 2.4 talks about knowing how to access resources to support students, including those who have experienced trauma, homelessness, and foster care, incarceration, and or are medically fragile. Lastly, TPE 2.5 talks about maintaining high expectations for learning and with appropriate support for the full range of students in the classroom. Now I'm going to be talking about TPE 4.1. TPE 4.1 talks about locating and applying information about students' current academic status, content and standards related learning needs and goals, assessment data, language proficiency status, and cultural background for both short and long-term instructional planning purposes. TPE 4.2 talks about understanding and applying knowledge of the range and characteristics of child development, whether they are typical or atypical, from birth through adolescence to help the teacher make next steps and create learning experiences for all students. TPE 4.3 talks about designing and implementing instruction and assessment that reflects the connection or the connections within academic content and student skills um, when students are developing skills in literacy, science, math, art, music, social science across the curriculum, and being able to apply um, the subject area of instruction inside and outside of the classroom. TPE 4.4 talks about planning, designing, and implementing and monitoring instruction and making use of instructional time to maximize learning opportunities. This essentially is saying that no time is wasted in instruction, and as educators, we are providing access to all students the curriculum that we are teaching, and removing barriers and providing access through instructional strategies. When I think of instructional strategies, I think of universal designing learning, MTSS, so tiers of behavior for both academic, behavioral, and social emotional skills, using instructional technology when necessary or assistive technology, and also making modifications for students with disabilities in the general education classroom as well as for the English language learners, and also using community resources and services where we see fit. Lastly, TPE 4.5 talks about promoting student success by providing opportunities for students to understand and advocate strategies that meet their learning needs and assist students with specific learning needs to successfully participate in transitioning. So being aware of students' IEPs, IFSPs, ITPs, 504 plans, SSTs, etc. And for me, my typical classroom practices in these areas of TPE2 and 4 are as follows. So before I even talk about what I do in those respective TPEs, the biggest difference that I've mentioned earlier between TPE 2 and 4 is that one is dedicated to classroom culture, social emotional growth, development, and individual responsibility. That's TPE 2, while TPE 4 mainly talks about planning, instruction, and designing learning experiences for all students. That was my main takeaway as far as the differences. If we're going to go a little bit more into detail about these TPEs, one difference that really stuck out to me is TPE 2.4 and TPE 4.4. TPE 2.4 talks about knowing how to access resources to support students, whereas TPE 4.4 talks about actually planning, designing, and implementing and monitoring instruction, which is very important. Which are very important because you are not only lesson planning and creating multi-sensory activities, at least for first graders, that's how my students learn the best, creating multi-sensory stations in which students are able to work independently and receive 5 to 7 minutes of direct instruction. I also have to implement principles of UDL and keep in mind multi-tier support systems in the academic, the behavioral, and social emotional realms so that classroom management is manageable and under control. Now I'm going to be talking about my own practices within those respective TPEs. In TPE 2, I usually hold community meetings in the morning, after recess, and after lunch to discuss various social emotional coping mechanisms as well as topics like honesty and academic behavioral misconduct, because there are moments when students forget, and that is okay because we tend to forget our norms and values from time to time, and that's why I have community meetings in the morning when we start, after recess, and after lunch. For TPE 2.2, I create small groups for both phonics and math based on skill level to really differentiate learning based on who's able to do what skill. So for math, I created a small group based on skill level, those who are able to do math word problems, another group that can just add and subtract numbers in between 0 to 20, and then another group where they focus on number sense between 11 and 100. TPE 2.3, I usually work with students of high social needs because they tend to get violent in the classroom by throwing chairs, or they push their desk out of the way, which can harm other students, and this mostly requires assistance from a second teacher. For TPE 2.4, I create anchor charts I create and keep old anchor charts from the first and early parts of second semester to let students access all parts of the curriculum. These anchor charts are color-coded well enough so that the information is chunked and not overstimulating. Lastly, in TPE2, I always set high expectations with students regarding behavior when playing outside for recess, walking inside the classroom, and getting ready for the next activity. Here in TPE4, this has to do with planning and implementing instruction. So that's something to keep in mind for myself. I assess students' phonics skills through a mastery or through SIPs, which is some sort of systematic phonics system that Oakland Unified School District has implemented. And there is a website where we enter data for students' completion of mastery tests. So that's one way I group students by phonics skills and looking at that data to create next groups. For TPE 4.2, I work with the third grade teacher throughout the year to conduct SEL lessons regarding modeling and behavior and safety, because first grade students and younger children in general feed off and learn from older kids. And what better way to do that than to have third grade join in on first grade's SEL lessons so that both classes, especially the third graders, know how to model and treat others with safe hands, safe bodies, and with respect and kindness and love. And my hope is for first graders to learn from these SEL lessons so that when they are older, they can be role models for generations to come. For TPE 4.3, I post creative writing prompts, such as, if you had a sleepover, who would you invite and what would you all do to practice free writing journals? Because in first grade, you are writing complete sentences and thoughts with correct punctuation, capitalization, spelling, and neatness. TPE 4.4, I have an on-site coach. Her name is Ms. Huffstutler, and I talked to her about introducing second grade material to Parker first grade students. With only a month left and Parker Elementary coming to a close, it actually closed down on May 25th, 2022. I decided to teach some second grade ELA knowledge, mainly phonics, since I have experience teaching second grade phonics. And lastly, TPE 4.5, I created small groups and multi-sensory stations to accommodate learners with high social emotional needs and for my English language learners, because I learned that that's what my students work best with. They work best with objects, kinesthetics, or they're more of kinesthetic visual learners, and I think that is attributed to digital learning and technology. Students and children in general are always on, iPads, their parents' iPhones, or if they have their own technology, they'd be on that, and they learn best through visual cues. And so, to summarize, how I implement effective instructional practices so that my individual goals are met. I always set the expectation at the very beginning of the lesson so that students know what to expect. I also talk about what not to do when, for example, they're working with materials. I do an explanation, and then I model what to do with set materials, what not to do with set materials, and then I have students model for the class what to do, and then I have another student model what not to do, so that we see differences in, oh, I know I should be doing this, oh, I know I should definitely not be doing this, and that helps me create a safe and equitable learning environment. I think for me, something that I want to work on as I approach the 2022-23 school year is having a set system on consequences. So a tier MTSS for consequences, not only just for academic, behavioral, and social emotional, but for consequences solely. So maybe tier one would be a redirection. Tier two would be a conversation at the side of the classroom where it's less public, more private. Um, tier three would be a letter or phone call home to the parent, and then tier four would be maybe an SST and constant calls home to the parent. So that is my summary on how implementation of effective instructional practices help my goals with promoting a safe and equitable learning environment with regards to TPE 2 and 4. That was really cool to unpack, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I'll see you later now.